Hello there. Welcome back to JP Studies. This is video 2 of the Jonah series for JP Studies, the Bible, the Book of Jonah. So this video, we are going to talk about crying out to a merciful God. That's the title of this chapter. This will be chapter 2 of the Book of Jonah. And we're going to start out right after Jonah got picked up by the fish. So if you don't remember, we just wrapped up chapter 1 in the last video, and we had this map to kind of show us what was going on. We have Jonah, the prophet from the northern kingdom, from Gath-Hepher, who was called by God to go to Nineveh. You see here on the map we have Gath-Hepher and we have Nineveh off to the north and east. And Jonah decided against that trip and went to Joppa to hop on a boat on its way to Tarshish. So the beginning of the story is Jonah receives word from God to go somewhere, and he goes in the opposite direction to Tarshish. However, while he was on that boat, God sent a storm, revealing his sovereign power over nature. Jonah's disobedience ended up endangering both him and the sailors who were on that boat. And the pagan sailors responded with worship and reverence to Jonah's God, especially after they threw him off the boat and the storm went away. And we ended chapter 1 with God appointing a great fish to rescue Jonah from death. And that leads us right here into Jonah chapter 2. So let's get started off with the first passage, Jonah 2, 1 through 3. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. So a couple things that we want to highlight here. One, this prayer is coming, as verse 1 tells us, from the belly of the fish. So Jonah was swallowed by this great fish that God appointed at the end of chapter 1, after obviously fleeing from God's call. This prayer is not a prayer requesting rescue, but of thanksgiving for already being rescued. We'll find out more, and we'll keep talking about this as we go, but the structure and the language of this prayer is going to feel really, it's going to feel really similar, really reminiscent of going through the Psalms, and we're talking a little bit more about that later on. And then at the very end of this passage, we have Jonah speaking from the threshold of death, reflecting on God's mercy. So when we talk about out of the belly of Sheol, we're talking about the Jewish concept of death. They didn't have as neatly as defined heaven and hell like we have now. It was kind of just this ambiguous, almost like a Hades area where the dead go after they're no longer alive. And the sea was a major representation of what that looked like because, deep sea scuba diving, swimming across large bodies of water, all of these things weren't very popular yet. So typically, if you went into this water, you weren't coming back out. So it was kind of a one-way trip to get cast into the sea, especially out in the middle of the sea. So that's where we are here. We have Jonah in the belly of a fish and calling out to the Lord somewhat thankfully, as we see in this first passage. So let's keep reading. Jonah 2, 3 through the first half of 6. As you'll sometimes see verses broken up into A and B. That's the designation I used here. So here I'm breaking up verses 6 into an A and B. So we're doing Jonah 2, 3 through the first half of 6. So 6A. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Very poetic language. There's a very good chance when you're reading this in your paper Bible or even in your the Bible app, you'll notice the spacing goes different. So Jonah 1's probably all going to be justified left, and then we get into Jonah 2, and all of a sudden everything's kind of justified down the middle and everything's centered. They're going to do that anytime the translator of your Bible decides they think this is poetry, and I think it's pretty obvious that Jonah is mimicking the style of a psalm, a very similar language. We'll talk about that on this next slide. So we have a few things to talk about here. One, it's very visual. Jonah is speaking in a very visual way of what it's like to drop like a rock in very deep water. So he's talking about going into the water. He's talking about the waves going over his head. He's talking about sinking under the water and no longer being in the waves, but dropping and dropping and dropping. He talks about the temple. We'll come back to that. But then the waters close in. The deep surrounds me, so he keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. He's just sinking in this water. The weeds wrapped around my heads at the roots of the mountains. We're talking about the plant life, the seaweed, the things that are at the bottom. Those things are wrapping around his body, wrapping around his head. The roots of the mountains, are we talking about? That's where the base of the mountain starts. So, here we're, the ocean, you kind of look at it flat, but at the bottom of the ocean, it's that big hole. And when you have mountains surrounding that water, you're looking at what they would call the root of the mountain. So from the bottom of the lake all the way up, it kind of just keeps going up the whole way. So poetically, they're talking about that as the foot of the mountain, despite that when you're looking at a mountain, that's not the foot you see. But in this kind of language, that's what he's talking about. And then finally, he's talking about going down to the land whose bars closed forever. And when we go back to talking about that Jewish concept of Sheol, when we find pottery, when we find random things that depict death, depict the land of death, especially during this era, they're represented by bars, like what we would see as prison bars. Like there's just columns kind of around it. When I was studying this, one of the things I found was like almost like an urn where it just has reliefs on the side of it, and it's just a series of bars and people just kind of hanging around in a city behind those bars. So when they think about, we would consider it a jail cell, but to them they're looking at more of a depiction of what the land of death is, because once you go there you can't get back out. So he's talking about really being at death's door. The other thing is, like I mentioned it before, he's talking about the temple. And if you remember, we talked about it last time. Jonah is from the north kingdom of Israel. So this is, if you remember your history after Solomon, the kingdom split. We have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And it's real easy to think, oh, well, Israel's the place where Jerusalem is, but it's not. So when they split, Israel didn't get Jerusalem. Judah got Jerusalem. So being a northern kingdom prophet, he did not have access to the temple in Jerusalem. So the talk of the temple is somewhat strange, but also very sad for someone who receives God's word, but can't go to his temple because he's on the other side of the border. So he's in the northern kingdom expressing this hope of a restored relationship with God, despite being from the northern kingdom, which doesn't have the temple, and they put up all their own temples. And as we read in Kings last time, they weren't really following God all that well anyway. So not a lot of good places there where you'd really come into contact with God, or a place that you would call a reputable temple. So we've been talking about, once again, that centered text as we talk about how the Bible handles poetry, but also how reminiscent this feels of the Psalms. And I wanted to highlight this. We're going to talk about this. I'll bring the slide up now, but we're going to talk about this more I'm going to do a separate video on the Bible tools and the study that kind of goes into this study I've done on Jonah. And that'll be another video at the end when I'm all done with all 4 chapters. But this one I really wanted to highlight just to show um, how very similar to the Psalms these are. So these are what we call cross-references. If you look here, we have a section of the Bible that way, where you see once again that text is justified. And so it's all down the middle and it's spread out. So the Bible's kind of, your translation is kind of cueing you as to say, hey, we believe this is poetry. And then you see all the little letters. So we have the X, the Y, the Z, all these little letters as the verses go down. And you see in the bottom picture here, that way again, where I've hovered over that C, and then you see where it says, then I said, I am driven away from your sight. You see in the hover there, it says Psalm 31:22. So what the translators or what the Bible, the people who've published this particular Bible are trying to highlight is that these verses either quote or they're very similar to, or they have very similar wording to different passages in the Bible. That's what we always see. Another great example of this is in the very first chapter of Jonah, when it says Jonah, the son of Amittai. There's going to be a letter right there, and if you go to it, it's going to take you to that King's reference that we read last week. So you're going to see all of these cross-references. Now, the resource right here is simply a cross-reference resource. We'll talk about this one more in the video about resources, but this one doesn't have a column for cross-references. It's purely just an aggregate of all the different cross-references that you'll see. And if you look through this, there are a lot of cross-references to a lot of the parts of the Bible, but repeatedly Psalms over and over and over again. There's tons of them just as we go down this list of chapter 2. So it's very obvious that Jonah was well versed in the Psalms, even as a prophet of a kingdom that wasn't following God all that well. He was very comfortable working in the Psalms and quoting the Psalms and sounding very similar to the Psalms, which all comes back to he's very knowledgeable of them and he spends a lot of time in them. And so this prayer that we're seeing, this thanksgiving that we're seeing in Jonah, we're seeing a lot of that dedication to the Psalms surfacing as he's thanking God. So let's get back into it from 6b, so the second part of verse 6 through 7. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. So here we find a really common theme across all of Christianity, really, where we find God at our lowest. So quite literally and figuratively, Jonah is very low. He's in the bottom of the sea. And here, in the most dire moment, he finds God. He remembers the Lord. And if we remember, the whole point of him going to Tarshish was to flee the Lord, right? So he gets this message to go to Nineveh, and instead of going to Nineveh, he runs away thinking that he's getting away from God or doing something. And yet, here he is in the bottom of the ocean, understanding that his prayer made it to God, that God wasn't so restricted to only being in the temple in Jerusalem, that his prayers wouldn't reach him from the ocean. His desire for rescue doesn't fall on deaf ears, that God hears him despite the fact that he's run away from God, despite the fact that he's nowhere near the land of Israel, nowhere near the temple, nowhere near where he's supposed to be. Here we have verses 8 and 9. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So we have a very happy Jonah, and there's a couple, we'll talk about how this is there's some negative and some positive here. But first, Jonah is talking about a Thanksgiving sacrifice. So he's likely promising a Thanksgiving offering, which isn't necessarily a commitment to go to Nineveh, a commitment to change, or really anything other than a material gift offered in thanks for deliverance. So a thank you card, oh hey, you really bailed me out there, thanks. So this was something that's good, the right thing to do, but may fall short of what you would expect. Like, if you put yourself in his shoes and having run from God and having been saved by God, uh, is that where you go? Oh, thanks for saving me, and then just leaving it at that. But on the flip side, we get in verse 1, it tells us that Jonah is in the belly of this fish. Jonah is not yet on dry ground. However we want to believe about the fish or about what's going on with the fish, um, Jonah is mid-rescue. I mean, the important bit here is that Jonah is mid-rescue. And this rescue isn't, I think a good example here would be like the Coast Guard, right? So if you're out on a, delightful 3-hour tour and your boat gets capsized, instead of being stuck on an island for a bunch of years, if the Coast Guard comes and you get on the Coast Guard boat and they're taking you back home, you're gonna pretty much feel rescued. Like, you're not really all that concerned that the Coast Guard is not going to get you home. Like, you're going to be like, oh yeah, these guys, this boat is solid. These guys know what they're doing. These are all professionals. I am so thankful that the right people saved me and I don't have to worry. Like, I could relax and be saved. I'm not so sure that this rescue is to that level. We're in a precarious spot in the belly of a fish. That's not a safe place to be. So Jonah is, we would call, kind of mid-rescue, and it's kind of a mid-questionable rescue in terms of how I'm emotionally going to feel about this kind of a rescue. So on the positive side, Jonah is giving thanks kind of mid-salvation, mid-rescue. And this salvation doesn't necessarily feel all that salvation-y. It kind of feels like you got ate by a fish. So there is that that kind of duality there where it's a really good thing. I mean, Jonah accepting that this is what rescue looks like and trusting that this rescue is complete and that God's not going to let him be digested or stay in the fish forever. I mean, he's putting a lot of trust in God that this is the rescue, that he is safe, that he is good. And that is something to attribute very positively to Jonah. But this is the end of the prayer. Salvation belongs to the Lord. It's a great way to end a prayer. Sounds really great. But don't forget, we're talking about someone who was told by God to do something, didn't do it, ran away from it, and then got caught. We're missing some kind of key components of like, hey, I'm sorry. Hey, I promise I'm going to do better. Hey, I promise I'm going to go do that thing you asked me to do. Thanks for rescuing me. We're missing some of that. So that is an area where we might wonder, is Jonah, what's kind of the interior state of Jonah? And we'll find out more about that, especially in chapter 4. The last note I want to add for this section is in the very beginning. It's kind of an odd thing for Jonah to say. When he's talking about those who pay regard to vain idols, forsake their hope for steadfast love. While we don't see record of Jonah praying to false idols, his countrymen 100% were. It told us in Kings that they were praying to idols and that they weren't following God. We know that. And he's the prophet to these guys, and we don't see record of him correcting them or doing anything. And so this sounds oddly prideful for someone who ran away from God. It's an odd thing. It's true. He's not saying anything that's not true, but it's odd for someone in Jonah's position, with Jonah's history of where he was in the Northern Kingdom and the state of the Northern Kingdom, to really harp on this idea of vain idols and forsaking their hope of love, and then I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. I mean, these are true things, and he is going to offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God, but it was kind of an odd thing for Jonah to really kind of make this detour on a prayer that's already missing some key components of what we think should be there. And lastly, the very last verse of chapter 2 is, "And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon dry land." Worst Uber ever. All right. So let's take a look at our questions here. So once again, feel free to pause the video if you want to take a screenshot of these questions and think about them or use them in a small group discussion or however you want to consume this content, but let's just review them really quickly. So what stands out to you about Jonah's prayer? Is his prayer what you would expect? How do Jonah's words reflect both fear and faith? What do you think is missing from Jonah's prayer? We've talked about that quite a bit already. This is another good one. Have you ever experienced God's mercy when you felt unworthy of it? You have to imagine Jonah felt something along those lines. And then why is it significant that Jonah gives thanks before he's back on land? The chapter 2 makes very explicit. Verse 1 is he's in the belly of the fish and he starts this prayer. Verse 10, the Lord commands the fish and he vomits him onto dry land. So all of the prayer happens between eaten by fish, vomited by fish. Delightful board picture, right? And lastly, how does Jonah's experience teaches us about how God hears us in our lowest moments? I do think that's a really big takeaway here from the book of Jonah. That one of the things, I was just mentioning it today actually, we may walk a million steps away from God, but God's only one step away. So, it's we can walk as far as we want, but all it takes is one step back and you're there. So that's what Jonah found at the bottom of the sea. So for application, as we wrap up this chapter 2, God meets us even when we're in the depths, whether that's physically, like Jonah, emotionally, probably also like Jonah, and spiritually, 100% Jonah. When we call out sincerely, God hears and responds, even when we don't deserve it. I think Jonah's another great example of undeserved mercy and undeserved grace. Someone who completely just threw God away and ran, and God pursued him, and God even, instead of just punishing him, he went through the motions of saving him, and Jonah understood that he was saved. So next one here is gratitude can be an act of faith before we see resolution. Going back to that mid-fish prayer. Sometimes our rescue doesn't happen on our time. The rescue that starts and ends isn't instant. Sometimes these things take a while. Sometimes these things don't just happen. They're not instantaneous. It's not the microwave heat up. It's the slow cooker heat up, and it takes a while for that to happen. And Jonah shows us that, despite the 3 days, we'll find out that he was in the fish for 3 days later, but despite his 3 days in the fish, he expressed that gratitude mid-rescue. And lastly, we have God's salvation may come in unexpected or uncomfortable ways, but it is still salvation. Goes right back to that rescue, that comparing a fish, the inside of a fish, to the Coast Guard boat. It's a very different rescue, but a rescue nonetheless, and equally came from God in whichever way it would have happened. So sometimes we have to accept the salvation that we receive for what it is, despite the fact that it's not the prince in shining armor or the giant, the white horse or whatever it is that you might have expected. Sometimes it comes in various forms and shapes. And lastly, for our reflections, we just ask some things that get brought up in this chapter. So, where have you seen God's mercy in your own life? Uh, and once again, Jonah's a great example of how that mercy isn't necessarily deserved. Um, and so, where have you seen that in your life? Are you willing to thank God even before the storm is over? So in this case, the storm was over when Jonah went into the water, but Jonah's storm wasn't over. So Jonah had a while before he got vomited out onto dry land. And so him thanking God during that process is a great example for us, despite his other shortcomings. And then Jonah offered that vow of thanksgiving for something that God had done for him. What vow of thanksgiving could we offer to God this week? We all have things that we can be thankful for. And I think I see other people on YouTube do this when they do interviews, like what's something you're thankful for this week, or what are the top however many things that you're thankful for right now. And I think that's a great exercise to do and to reflect on that it's God that we're thankful to for the provisions that he's given us. And so I think that's another great way to wrap up our week as we move forward and get ready to look at Jonah 3 on the next video. We'll see you then. Bye for now.